What is a classical liberal? It sounds like someone who's a liberal, but perhaps a bit fancier.
People like to get sneaky and use, no, I'm a classic liberal. Oh, what is that? What is that?
Exactly.
You're a fucking Republican.
The classical liberal tradition was born from great thinkers such as John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Jefferson.
No, I'm a classic liberal.
The core belief that the individual should always be considered above the group always remained constant. Individual.
No, I'm a classic liberal.
There's already a little classical liberal in you right now.
Welcome to the One Dime Podcast. I'm the host and YouTuber One Dime, and I run the One Dime channel and the One Dime Podcast. Today I am here with my friend Melody, also known as A World to Win. You can find her Twitter in the description as well as her YouTube channel. She is a scholar, a socialist organizer, and major book reader. And today we will be talking about liberalism, particularly liberalism from a critical lens. Not just the liberal ideals, but the economic origins and context of liberalism. We're going to be going over particularly findings from Domenico Losurdo's book called Liberalism, A Counter-History. Before we get deep into it, how would you like to introduce yourself and what exactly you do and maybe plug your channel?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Melody, 28-year-old trans woman from the Pacific Northwest, graduate student of economics, and I have a YouTube channel called A World to Win, where I talk about mostly history and politics through sort of a Marxist lens. And my background is in the natural sciences. I have a degree in physics. That's me.
What got you into revolutionary communist organizing and theory, per se?
Well, I can make a whole podcast episode about that, but I'll just give you the Cliff Notes. The Cliff Notes version is, I was, I think, in high school when the big recession happened back in 2007, 2008. I just started high school. I was well aware of the fact that there was, poverty in the world. That didn't escape me. But what really, it didn't hit me just the extent of the cruelty of the system until, I had friends that were either homeless or about to become homeless or suddenly couldn't afford to, put as much food or food at all on their tables, and, all kinds of other problems that accompany economic distress, parents developing drug or alcohol problems, that sort of thing. So it became suddenly kind of very real to me. And I think the first real political action I ever took part in was Occupy Wall Street in 2011. So I was, I think, about 18 years old. After Occupy kind of fizzled out, I had radicalized in definitely sort of what I would call very loosely an anarchist direction. Wasn't well read on theory. I liked blocking up with people and doing that stuff. So I called myself an anarchist. As I was not deep in it. I was not deep in with a community or anything like that. But it was...
Seems to be a common story with a lot of people.
It was what I was a part of for, I'd say 2 or 3 years. And then I sort of kind of retreated from politics and finished my degree. And it's kind of through the university that, I also have a degree in economics. So I was sort of introduced to Marx and Lenin through the academy in that way, but also through sort of campus organizing.
What? You learned Marx and Lenin in university?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm not huge amounts, but enough to kind of whet my appetite and get me to read it on my own.
I had in my political theory class, history of political thought. That was the only class they ever mentioned Marx, and we had 3 months on John Locke, Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes in 1 week, one lesson on Marx, and it was the Communist Manifesto.
Our economics department was lucky enough to be blessed with a handful of very talented heterodox economists, including one guy who is actually my neighbor and has been on my YouTube channel before, Yusuf Godaparas. he taught me Marxist political economy in my junior year of undergrad, and it was a whole junior level econ course devoted to reading Capital cover to cover, and it was a hell of a ride.
I mean, I think a lot of people who are on the, more broadly speaking, the socialist / communist left, there's this sense that people often come from a liberal background or sometimes a libertarian background. I'm economically, fiscally conservative, but socially liberal, right?
But anybody actually can say what that means if you put the question to them. Does that mean like gays are all right, but let's cut welfare for the poor? Most people wouldn't say that. I mean, maybe they would, but like if you actually like to ask them to put pen to paper and tell you what their ideas are, I don't think they would be able to answer you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people come from a background that's more broadly a little bit liberal. And there's this perception that the liberalism generally is either center or left of center.
Right. Or that it just
right of center.
Or that it just is the left, because that's the
the far left.
Right. Because that's the political.
Some people think Kamala is
Kamala
Harris is a communist.
Right. Well, Hillary Clinton's a communist, if you ask any right winger. But because of the kind of binaristic political framework that we're all introduced to through the media, through the ideological state apparatuses, right, through the media, through the school system, right. There's two ideologies. There's liberalism and conservatism. The way that it's taught is that there are two different ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. This one's left, this one's right. Those are your choices.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like that's a lot of the way like people growing up in Western liberal democracies are taught things. And what's funny is when digging into like the history of liberalism, we can kind of see that pretty much most of the mainstream ideologies and political choices that we have more or less resemble liberalism. It's just that the term liberalism is used very broadly. And of course, there's some distinctions. And this is where I kind of want to go to define liberalism a bit, because the definition is very amorphous. It's generally when it prioritizes free markets, economic liberalization, free trade, but also it prioritizes equality. Moral equality, not equality of outcome, but equality
before the law.
Yeah. So basically, which is obviously a very vague notion, as well as liberty. Liberty is the famous thing that people attribute to liberalism, and we'll go into defining that. But it's there's like it's kind of blows conservatives and libertarians' minds that like actually Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, and Bernie Sanders, social democrats are actually just variations of liberalism, but on different ways. You can say that obviously that like Republicans aren't socially liberal, but they're economically liberal. Like it's not all very different from Democrats. And even the case of Bernie Sanders, right, he's still maintaining like a liberal capitalist order, just with that's friendlier,
right,
in terms of
you
could
state. Go as far as saying that the Democrats and Bernie Sanders and that whole spectrum are not even socially liberal, because they keep making concessions to the Republicans on everything.
Yeah, well, I would definitely say that with the Democrats, by and large, because the Democrats will pay lip service, right, to these social issues, but they won't actually do anything.
Right. They'll pose for selfies during the campaign season, but then actually when they're in office, they end up just making, And
I think it was until like 2013 when Hillary Clinton finally supported gay marriage, right?
Right. And there's still
fairly recently.
Yeah. And there's still Democrats right now who don't support full like abortion rights or anything like or trans rights, that kind of thing.
But yeah, generally speaking, the term liberalism has shifted a lot over time, and there's distinctions to be made between classical liberalism. You'll famously hear that from some very conservative-leaning people like Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson. And you have embedded liberalism, which I would say is more or less what we think of as liberalism today, big government, pro-social progress, and then neo-liberalism, the famous thing. How would you define or differentiate these terms? Because obviously these things aren't the same thing, despite all being under the umbrella of liberalism.
Well, right. So they have obviously a common, intellectual lineage and a few, I wouldn't say necessarily consistent, but persistent features throughout their history that haven't changed a whole lot, such as, the sanctity of private property rights, the notion of equality before the law, at least ostensible equality before the law, and just a general kind of uncritical view of capitalism as a socioeconomic system.
Yeah,
Like those those are all features that I think are common to all of what we now call classical liberalism, embedded liberalism, and neoliberalism. I think probably the only caveat that I'll give to that is that embedded liberalism,
free markets.
I think the only kind of minor exception there is embedded liberalism, in that embedded liberalism was clearly sort of certain aspects of it were clearly a kind of concession to social democratic stirrings in the mid 20th century in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that so-called embedded liberalism is maybe the one that is the most, at least on the surface, critical of capitalism as such. But sorry, you were saying.
Well, I would say the thing that, embedded liberalism, which is more or less what we know to be social democracy. We use that, but I also like to use embedded liberalism is actually, I think you would agree, it's really looking out for the long-term interests of capital and markets. Yes. Because it's not like so much an exception to liberalism. It's just like a desperation of liberalism to save itself. Kind of like the way fascism basically is, like fascism obviously is, it does away with due process, and it does away with the separation, or like the ostensible separations between the state and capital, and it just kind of takes it over. But that's like also another reaction to save capital, like as we see with Weimar Germany, Hitler.
So the way that I generally frame it is that social democracy and fascism are sort of capital's two safety buttons in case of social unrest. Press here. Social democracy is capital going, we've got torches and pitchforks at the door, we better throw out some loaves and fishes. Fascism is saying, fascism is the alternative of the torches and pitchforks are at the door, let's just steamroll them.
Basically,
so they're the carrot and stick options that capital has against
good cop, bad cop.
It's the good cop and bad cop of capital.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, I kind of postulate a similar thesis in my Why Billionaires Support Democrats video, which basically says like the Democrats the Democrats are far from social democrats.
No, but they like to liberalism. Think that they are.
Yeah, and historically, like under Roosevelt, they played that. And obviously, we might want to think, as some right-wingers like to portray it, that Roosevelt and Clement Attlee in England represented a new ideology. But in reality, as if you can even take like how they describe themselves, as Roosevelt literally says, "I saved capitalism." Yeah, and he was like a super rich guy.
Yeah, the best friend the profit system ever had.
Exactly. And essentially like embedded liberalism, more or less, it's to save capitalism, but from what exactly? It's usually when there's like political unrest and you have the pressure of labor unions, militant labor strikes, communists. And I would say like, in the case of embedded liberalism in like Scandinavia, the social democratic utopias that we talk about in like Sweden, Denmark, or Nordic countries like Finland, that was heavily pressured by the USSR because they're literally neighbors and
literally at the doorstep. Yeah. I think that's a huge kind of overlooked factor in the history of European social democracy and embedded liberalism, which I think a lot of Americans tend to take for granted just because that we are fed such a one-dimensional history of the Soviet Union, if we're taught anything at all about it.
Yeah, and I will say there is some distinction to be made between like embedded liberalism as we're talking about it in practice and social democracy, like how it was sort of founded in Germany under the
Right.
SPD with people like Kautsky and Bernstein who thought that you could
Right.
kind of, they saw it as like a process of like gradually voting in socialism, but through like a really
Yeah.
gradual
Well,
process, which
and
obviously didn't pan out. But
I think I think there are the common threads of social democracy and liberalism in those kind of historical ways is that right they're both trying to kind of round off the harsh edges of capitalism, right? They're trying to expand the social safety net and provide social provisions to working class people, but I think they differ in kind of terms of origin because, like, for example, the German social democratic movement was the organic product of workers struggling, whereas I think embedded liberalism in the United States, for example, was more a response to it than a product of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
100%.
I think embedded liberalism, of Franklin Roosevelt and the subsequent kind of social, welfare capitalism that followed right up until kind of the 70s under both Democrats and Republicans, by the way. This is not a one party thing.
Yeah, like 91% tax rate under Eisenhower.
Right. So I think the critical difference is that embedded liberalism in the United States, despite having some common features with embedded or with social democracy in terms of policy, was structurally in terms of how and why those decisions got made and who made them were very different. Much more top down in the United States and much more kind of an organic product of workers' movements in Europe.
Yeah, and I would say like a good example between those sort of responsive social democrats, like the embedded liberals, and the more what you could call radical social democrats, is I would say like a perfect example is Elizabeth Warren versus Jeremy Corbyn or Sanders. Is in the case of Corbyn, there is this like way to kind of implement a more or less socialistic worker-owned economy through the liberal framework. Like, unlike a kind of what more Marxian or anarchist approach would be to like literally seizing private property, Corbyn's policies more wanted to like encourage the establishment of worker co-ops when it comes to lending through credit unions, but also allowing workers to buy up their own enterprises when companies would file for bankruptcy. But whereas like Elizabeth Warren there's no mention of worker ownership whatsoever.
Right.
It's really just
technocratic solutions.
Pretty much, yeah. It's big government. It's like when the government does stuff, like what people think, socialism is.
Right.
But I think it's like, now that we're talking about embedded liberalism, it's worth mentioning like how did that dissolve? And then we got Neo-Liberalism, which was obviously, started more or less in the 70s, and you had it first implemented actually under like a fascist dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and kind of more over in America, in the UK with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But of course, it was kind of more gradual. It was happening before that.
I mean, you could point to somebody like Jimmy Carter,
or even Kennedy. I would say JF Kennedy too. It's like he started the deregulations.
Right. Because the post-war boom really starts kind of hitting its upper limits starting in the 60s. Really, it's not until real like bad stagnates, like the stagflation crisis of the 70s hits, that it's like really clear that capital is running out of steam.
Yeah, and more or less the way, I think this is like a simplification, but the way I would define neoliberalism, it's essentially a reversion to classical liberalism, something we'll talk about, except that with classical liberalism, essentially more or less postulates a limited government and that markets are best when left free and with minimal intervention, so that markets will promote the well-being of society. But what that is like the flourishing of capital. And neoliberalism is more that, but plus a more heavy state role, whereas like the state needs to maintain the well-being of markets. So by any means necessary, the state literally using force to open up more markets, whether that be like imperialism in practice, the privatization, or in the case of whereas before you would have the embedded liberals sort of negotiate with unions and different interest groups, whereas neoliberals, like we saw with Reagan, literally just fired the air traffic control strikers. And,
with a single freaking pen stroke too. No weird
brutally
negotiations. Yeah, it was absolutely one of the most atrocious crimes against organized labor in the history of the United States.
Yeah, and they like totally cracked down on all the protesters in a much more brutal fashion with the militarization of the police. And we often attribute like neoliberal theory sometimes to Milton Friedman and sometimes Hayek and von Mises, but Hayek and von Mises were more strictly classical liberals. Classical liberals is, libertarianism. We can call it libertarianism. I know it's a little bit different, but
I think it blurs the line a little bit though, because you mentioned earlier that just a moment ago that neoliberalism is really in many ways just a resurrection of classical liberalism on the ideological level. I think is really not so different from its prefixless ancestor. But what I think that, a lot of the people who we now retroactively kind of avant la lettre call neoliberal were influenced by people like Mises, Hayek, and those other thinkers of that era, because they wrote and they played advisory roles and so on. And
we can see like the laissez-faire era, like the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover era. That's like classical liberalism, more or less. But we should talk about the origins of classical liberalism, the ideas, and particularly the economic origins of it, like what incentivized it, what was the project of classical liberalism. And of course, for those who are not aware, the founders of classical liberalism often described to be people like John Locke, the first major theorist who played a very important role in the drafting of the English Constitution after the so-called Glorious Revolution, as England became one of the first liberal democracy as we know it. And you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is more on like the left wing outside of liberalism, of classical liberalism. And you have Adam Smith. I would say these thinkers do deviate in many ways, but people often describe classical liberals as John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and in terms of classical liberal politicians, people like who drafted the American Declaration of Independence, people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin.
Right.
And but yeah, like what do you think are important things to like to know when it comes to like the economic origins of liberalism? Because that's like not taught in most standard history textbooks.
Right. So before we get to that, I just wanted to kind of make a comment on what you just said there, which is that we kind of are, through storytelling, through historiography, we are lumping together thinkers who had kind of, not totally incompatible ideology, but wouldn't have necessarily all been Bezzy mates back in the day, right? Like
definitely not Rousseau. Like Rousseau and Adam Smith are the two.
Right, exactly. Like Rousseau, Adam Smith, and Thomas Jefferson are very different thinkers. And I think we ascribe the liberalism moniker to them kind of retroactively because they have these sort of common features that we are identifying doing that kind of historiography and historical archaeology of ideas, whatever you want to call it. But that doesn't mean that they all got together in a smoke-filled room and decided this is what liberalism is. Right?
And it's definitely like, I would say in terms of how liberalism turned out and what was actually put in practice, I think it's better to like emphasize John Locke and John Stuart Mill and, the founding fathers of America, because so like really liberalism practiced in England and America, because Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we don't really see, Jean-Jacques Rousseau essentially is, you could, in today's terms, describe him as like a socialist, or as Engels kind of polemically calls him like a utopian socialist, right?
Right. Proto-socialist, yeah.
Proto-socialist, yeah. And in the case of Adam Smith was like, one of the founders of what we call today capitalism. But Adam Smith more so, he was against like the idea of landlords. He thought landlords was a stupid concept. He's often described with like the Georgian school of economics, which is more or less capitalism without, landlordism.
Yeah. Adam Smith, you mentioned kind of economic history and how that plays into the origins of contemporary liberalism. And I will be, perfectly honest, I don't know a huge amount about all these other thinkers other than what we learned from reading Losurdo's book. Mm-hmm. But in the case of Adam Smith, I do know a little bit more in that. And if folks want to look into this more detail, kind of check my sources here, check out The Invention of Capitalism by Michael Perelman. That's kind of the source that I'm bouncing around in my head right now, trying to formulate these thoughts, which is that Adam Smith himself was not a bourgeois. Like he was kind of you could place him in sort of as like a middle class intellectual, and he was very much a economist of the middle class in the sense that he was very kind of skeptical of the good intentions of the big property owners and the big bourgeoisie and that sort of thing, and the kind of the potential for an overbearing state apparatus. And at the same time, he was clearly very disdainful of working people, thought they were, simple and expendable and that sort of thing.
Well, there's something worth mentioning with Adam Smith right there, because just remember like a quote that Domenico Losurdo highlights in his book is that Adam Smith was like super critical of the overemphasis of the liberal bourgeois on liberty and slavery, particularly because, of course, as we'll talk about later, is like the liberals were talking about being against political slavery, which for them was like taxation via the crown. But they were maintaining a stronger stance, more brutal stance on racial slavery because they wanted more liberty so that they could have total domination over their slaves. And Adam Smith found that totally despicable and hypocritical, the fact that they were talking about equality, yet they're like so pro-racial slavery. And he actually has a quote where he says, "I would prefer a despotic government, something like a despotic government rather than a without slavery than a liberal government with racial slavery."
Yeah.
Which is like an interesting point because, he's ascribed to be this, free marketeer who saw eye to eye with, the founding fathers, but that's, as we know, not true.
Right. And that I think is a really interesting, like one of the really interesting antinomies, whatever, I hate that word. I never pronounce it correctly, of early liberalism was the issue of slavery. And the word that Losurdo likes to use, the phrase that Losurdo likes to use is Herrenvolk democracy or master race democracy.
Yeah, I love that word.
These were all.
Bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, I hate it in terms of its substance, but I love it as a conceptual tool because these thinkers of so-called liberty were very much they're concerned with the liberty of the white race in very explicit terms sometimes, and that is really striking when reading Losurdo and reading the primary sources that he kind of brings in, where these guys are like without a shred of self-awareness or irony, saying we love liberty, liberty's great. Oh, by the way, Black people are subhuman and should serve us for all eternity.
Yeah, like Immanuel Kant saying that blackness is like a disease that infects people.
Right.
Or you have John Locke saying a quote that the difference between some humans than others is sometimes greater than humans and beasts.
Oh my gosh.
Which is like, he says like some terrible
that's
things.
Really awful.
Or like John Stuart Mill, who's often seen to be like the more left liberal. Often he's the one, for some reason, a lot of left-wingers, like even Chomsky, seem to be really charitable to. But John Stuart Mill, he also said that like he justified English imperialism and the genocide of natives on the basis that like they didn't have reason and that they need to be civilized before like,
right.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing and before we started recording, and we had this interesting little tidbit of conversation about how, the imperatives or the exigencies of settler colonialism are really inextricable from liberalism as a as part of its material history, right? Because I think that one thing that we keep kind of harping on is this difference between what liberalism tells itself that it is, the stories that liberalism tells itself about how it came to be and what it is and what it stands for, is very different from, but not extricable from its material history, in both the way that it was used to justify things like slavery and settler, genocide, and setting up institutions of ostensible, so-called liberty,
That's basically the segue.
Yeah,
I was gonna literally bring that up. That's perfect. But it's funny because I think a lot of people who study political theory in university can probably attest to this, because this was my experience. Is we're often taught about John Locke and the founders of liberalism in such a romantic fashion, and say, look how progressive he was against the king. Look at monarchy is so backward, and he's often juxtaposed with Thomas Hobbes, who is defending the monarchy, so he seems progressive. Locke seems progressive, and he's talking about against slavery and that everyone has the individual right to private property and stuff. And we think, oh, private property, that's good. Like you couldn't own that under King. But this totally idealist way of portraying the history of liberalism without detached from its economic context. We obviously will get into this, is that when John Locke is talking about private property, he's talking about private property for a very select few individuals. And when he talks about liberty, we attribute liberty to freedom in all senses, freedom of speech, freedom to do as you please. It's like a negative freedom.
Right.
This is like, we know the answer to this question is, what does liberty really mean when John Locke was talking about it? And of course, that's the freedom for property owners and slave owners, which of course slaves are property, considered property, is to have total domination of that and not to, be taxed, which for them, that taxation was the political slavery they sought to abolish. It wasn't racial slavery, right?
Right. It's what they polemically called political slavery, which is, really, in hindsight from us, it's a really kind of despicable hypocrisy.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also, you see the word liberty used today, it's even, obviously libertarians will always talk about liberty and whatnot. And
right.
You even have people on the left say that, you'll ask them like why they aren't Marxists or anarchists, right. And they'll say it's because I believe in liberty and private property laws. And right. It's like, well, liberty and property for who exactly, right?
Right.
Because this was Lenin designed for a certain amount of people. You mentioned at one point about how the economic context is separate from the ideas of liberalism, but it's also not separate from it. And that's a good point, because it might be one thing to, expose liberalism and its hypocrisy and whatnot. And Hannah Arendt, sometimes liberal thinkers like her, liberal social democratic thinkers, will say stuff like, you can't really apply today's standards to them, because back then slavery was normalized and racism was normalized. But Losurdo makes, yeah, that too, yeah. And Losurdo, he makes the really interesting thesis that liberalism slavery wasn't an exception to liberalism. Actually, liberalism is what made slavery worse and expanded slavery. So I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I know we both read the same parts of the book that highlight that and give a really interesting argument that's hard to really disprove.
Right. Then it all is connected to this sort of white colonial dialectic of who gets to count as a human and what does their freedom mean? What does their freedom count for? So this is the central importance of Losurdo's concept of Herrenvolk democracy or master race democracy, which is that this freedom is really the freedom to rape, pillage, and plunder the colonial, the soon to be colonial landscape, and the freedom to exploit the labor of Black slaves and profit from their misery.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna highlight this little quote from the first page of the chapter in the book called "Liberalism and Racial Slavery: A Unique Twin Birth," and it says, "Okay, slavery is not something that persisted despite the success of the three liberal revolutions. On the contrary, it experienced its maximum development. Following the success, the total slave population in the Americas reached around 330,000 in 1700, nearly 3 million by 1800, and finally peaked at over 6 million in 1850. So then there was Great Britain with the second most amount of slaves, and then Spain came after. He's trying to make the point that it's the irony, right? Is that as these states became more liberal, like the most liberal states were the most slave owning states. And that's just not a coincidence. It's because liberalism itself was an ideology essentially just to give autonomy from the crown from this emerging bourgeois. But what people might ask is why wasn't this the case before? And I think it's really worth looking into like the economic origins of this bourgeois class, right, and how they got so powerful and what their agenda was with liberalism. Because like mercantilism, I think is inseparable from all of this.
So the history of capitalism, as we're so often told, and this is kind of part of Adam Smith's legacy, is this mysterious thing that Adam Smith calls prior accumulation, and which Marx later acerbically refers to as primitive accumulation, which is to say, it all starts with something. It doesn't, capitalism doesn't start with a pile of money. You need to basically steal something, as I think Balzac said, or maybe it's not Balzac, I can't remember. Behind every great fortune is a great crime, which is to say, capitalism begins with colonial plunder and enclosure and expropriation of peasant land, and grows from there. So slavery is not only simply coextensive with capitalism in just terms of like, oh, well, they happen to be occurring at the same time, but like, no, actually slavery was absolutely critical in the development of historical capitalism. It could not have existed without it.
That's something. Go on, actually.
And totally inextricable from colonial plunder. And for folks who want to really just get next level galaxy brain on this, go read Gerald Horne's books on the history of settler colonialism and slavery. I would specifically recommend The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which is all about actually the 15th century. 15th and 16th centuries. He goes all the way back, 500-600 years ago to talk about sort of the origins of capitalism in this era that we generally don't think of in our sort of stereotypical historiography of capitalism being a very 18th century sort of phenomenon.
It's the rise of capitalism and slavery are like totally indistinguishable, inseparable.
And that's the other thing that gets totally abstracted from, particularly American history is labor history. There's a lot about labor history itself that within sort of leftist circles that I think gets kind of papered over in terms of how racist it was, but that's a story for another time. But what I'm trying to get at is that labor history is just straight up not talked about in American kind of presentations of history.
That's why we need people like Howard Zinn, who the racist capitalist state absolutely hates for a reason.
And Robin D.G. Kelly, and Mike Davis. Those are all real essential voices, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I would add, as we were talking about like the origins of capitalism and liberalism, is of course you had this. So the ideology of liberalism was more or less advocated by a bourgeois class. And what do we mean by bourgeois class? It was like the richest class of people below the aristocracy and the king. And how did these people get rich? Well, as we were talking about, is imperialism. And part of what kind of set this off was the Columbus obviously discovering all this new land. And with all these discoveries, you had this like unlimited potential of conquest. And you had, of course, countries like Britain, Spain, France. And of course, as America was later established, and after the American Revolution, they went on to do imperialism themselves, take all of Spain's territories. And but like you had this international trade, and because it was kind of risky to go out and explore, there was this incentive to like steal as much as you can when you go out there, and
right,
obviously
make it worth your while, so to speak.
Yeah, and also racism,
in like a really perverse sense. Like, yeah. I don't mean to say that to trivialize. This isn't like we're talking about the buying and selling of human beings for sheer financial economic gain like that. I cannot, like, I have to sort of always force to take a step back and just like how horrific that is, and how 500 years later we are still living in that system.
Yep. It's really, and also like the racism at the time enabled them the imperialists to basically massacre. And they first attempted to, of course, enslave the indigenous populations, but because they would die from a lot of the sicknesses that the whites brought there, they weren't as easily enslavable compared to the African populations. And and
they would straight up like murder them.
Yeah, they would just kill them. Yeah.
Well, what I mean is, right. The other thing, we really have to disentangle this idea that the indigenous folks were just like stupid and didn't know what was going on. No, they knew what was going on, and they were like, "Fuck this, we're gonna fight you." Yeah. And the other thing that gets like really glossed over is that like the conquerors, despite having actually ultimately prevailed, like they did not always win. Sometimes they would go in there to loot, rape, pillage, and plunder, and just get their asses handed to them and go crying home.
And you can see the outcomes in like South America, because you have some countries in South America that have the indigenous populations still survived, like whereas see some areas like Argentina was totally an indigenous country, but you don't see it's all white people there, and it's like, what happened to all the indigenous people? It's like, well, they killed them.
Well, and I think about like a place like Bolivia, where there's still active repression against the indigenous folks there, and just the way that Morales was treated by the American media, and by like he's like, I think perhaps their first indigenous president.
I think so. Yeah.
He was so roundly vilified by American media, and he's a dictator, and oh, by the way, Janine Áñez, the white fascist, is actually the legitimate president of Bolivia.
That's absolutely disgusting. I mean, Venezuela too is the way America does the same, but and also like the way Afro-Venezuelans are treated in Venezuela is absolutely horrifying, and you can see the difference by how like the party, Maduro and the Chavistas, treat the Afro-Venezuelans versus the opposition, and you can clearly tell where the imperialist lineage lies. Mm-hmm. But anyways, like back to what we were saying, is like these people, the imperialists, basically, you can really boil it down to the British, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, who are basically, they found this limitless possibility of discovery, and they got really wealthy from this trade. And we often describe this era as mercantilism, because the people who are getting rich were like basically merchants, and also they're taking people, enslaving them, and selling them like as on the market. And
merchants, I mean, specifically merchants acting under the franchise of the crown, which is what we mean by mercantilism, right? These aren't just like independent business people going out and doing this stuff. They're always like, and this is where I think we really have to talk about like the development of the capitalist state, because I think that is also really kind of been hollowed out from the history of like the origins of so-called liberal democratic government, which is that it's inextricable from colonialism and slavery, but it's also inextricable from the development of the contemporary capitalist state. All of the institutions that we know today, from the police to legal institutions to all the rest, have kind of their they bear the marks of this era.
Well, police literally having a was created to protect private property, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And as like peasants lost their means of subsistence, so they were naturally rebelling, and it was kind of alien, the fact that people, rich people could now just see a park and be like, I own that now. I'm going to buy that. I own this. It seems absurd. So you have a lot of people infringing on these private property rights, these glorious private property rights. And the police are created to basically stomp these people out. So liberty for the few. But it's worth mentioning just back. So the merchants, they would get all these, they would get slaves. They would get all of what they found, natural raw materials, gold, diamonds, all kind of things, just or simply just things that they would sell. They would make a lot of money, but they were taxed a lot by the crown, the king, and the aristocracy. So they weren't getting like the full share of what they were getting. So if naturally you had this kind of consciousness form amongst the emerging bourgeois class, and liberalism was basically emerged out of that. It was like a way to kind of legitimize them having their cake and eating it too, and to tell the king, fuck off, why are you taking our stuff? And that's what they polemically describe as political slavery. And that, like, we have to understand, like, if you're looking at this in a Marxian analysis, like, you can look at liberalism as the superstructure that helped rationalize this transition to what we know now is a capitalist state, capitalist liberal state that protects private property of these people who, essentially led what we call the bourgeois revolutions, whether it be the Glorious Revolution in America or the
you mean England?
England, or the American Revolution, right?
Right. But never the Haitian Revolution.
Yes, I wanted to bring that up later, actually, but now you brought it up. Is that's another element, is like the hypocrisy of liberalism, is when the Haitian Revolution happened in San Domingo or Saint Dominique. How do you
Saint Domingue? I don't know. I don't speak French.
Yeah, Saint Domingue.
No, they were all these erstwhile liberals, with the due exception of Hegel, by the way. They were all scandalized by it.
Yeah, that's the irony, right? Is like when liberal ideals were actually practiced by Black people who took them seriously, and the populations in
it's like, okay, liberty, fraternity, equality. Yeah, those are great ideas. Enslaved people. What if we tried to enact those things? White people. Uh-oh.
Basically, yeah, it's like liberty except for the people who are Black, brown, or not, or women, or anyone who isn't rich white dudes, basically.
Right, because those aren't people.
Yeah, that's another point. Is that I think and Losurdo also makes this point as well, and he's not the first to make this point, but which I'm about to say is that the ideology of liberalism and this idea of reason kind of helped legitimize a lot of what the liberals would do in terms of slavery or the treatment of indigenous peoples, is the idea that some people have this reason and have achieved this civilized liberal way of thinking, whereas the other people haven't, and they're not people. They haven't realized like humanity's potential.
It's an intrinsic racialized quality. It's something that it's not something that can be learned. It's something that is inherent.
Yeah, and that's where we can see a direct lineage between social Darwinism and liberalism. Is that like you can see like liberalism was a way to rationalize these economic incentives, economic goals, that's more powerful in a way than religion. Although of course religion also played a role with like Calvinism, but we also see like an effort was made to like create a science under social Darwinism that went in hand with classical liberalism to kind of justify the domination of rich whites to everyone else, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's Or is there something you wanted
Yeah,
to...
right. And I think that, the Marxist framing of base and superstructure in terms of like economic base being, slavery and early, colonialism, and the superstructure being the development of liberalism. I think that is a really relevant analysis here. But it does also show how, right, that it is not just this one-way relationship. That base and superstructure are in dialectic, they're in conversation, and that the base is not like this, like, I think the kind of the sort of pop Marxist, I guess, misreading of base superstructure is that like the base determines the superstructure in this,
No,
like,
they just go hand in hand.
right.
Yeah.
It's not this like it's the rails and the superstructure is the train. Now a lot of things can go on that train, but the train is on the rails, right? Like things, you can't have you can't text anybody in the year 1700. You have to write a letter and send it by horseback, right?
But often, like, the base does come first, like in the sense of the motives, financial motives of the liberal bourgeois class, and
Right.
the kind of liberal the ideology sort of follows that.
Right. In like Althusserian terms, like determination in the last instance, I think is how he would put it.
Yeah, given that we were talking about the base and the superstructure in the Marxian sense, I thought it would be important to make it some key differentiations between Marxism and liberalism. Although, of course, the different differences between classical liberalism and Marxism may seem rather obvious, but as we know, there's also a kind of left liberalism. You can draw that back to people like Rousseau and Voltaire, or maybe even Adam Smith for some people. But in more modern left liberal thinkers, we can look at someone like John Rawls as a person who describes more or less what could be looked at as like a Bernie Sanders, Corbyn type of politics.
Or Gunnar Myrdal, I think, is
Sure.
somebody I think of very immediately in terms of contemporary kind of left liberal or social democratic.
And in terms of the way these frameworks, whether in the left or right manifestations, we should make some important demarcations between idealism and dialectical materialism, which are really the two different ways in which liberals versus Marxists tend to see society, which I think is more important than what we believe, because talking about ideals for Marxists is almost like misses the point, because Marxists, we like to look at reality versus and material economic conditions that determine politics versus just ideals in the abstract sense.
Right.
So how would you describe like what people really need to know in terms of like these two distinctions, which are hard to reconcile?
Right. And I think that especially folks who are really accustomed to the vocabulary of materialism versus idealism can kind of get bogged down in this like sort of pejorative dialectic in which materialism is the thing that's correct and idealism is the thing that is incorrect, which I think is just like idealist. And this really, I know I just went full circle.
Well,
there,
it's definitely not dialectical.
No, yeah, it's very dogmatic. It's very it's a sort of binaristic thinking that I don't think is befitting of dialectics. But anyhow, which is that I think there's some things that are in terms of historiography, and that's, by the way, listeners will probably recognize this is my favorite word to say. I say it over and over and over, historiography. For those who are not familiar with the term, and academic historians are probably going to tear me a new one for it, but it is, in the way that I use it, it is the sense in which the way that we tell ourselves history. Historiography is about method. And the thing that I think really distinguishes Marxist historiography from liberal historiography is that liberal historiography is very kind of transhistorical in its thought. So the idea of historical transformation, how does it happen? For, I think, Marxists is really thinking about the very concrete specificities of a given historical situation, and looking at all the different, causal interactions, particularly in the realm of social forces, social classes, that shaped those conditions, right? Everything from technology to culture and religion and economics, right? It's very kind of all-encompassing and very that is what we mean by dialectics, is looking at the whole, looking at the connection between past, present, and future.
And contradictions. I think that's the biggest thing, right?
Contradictions, right? In the Marxist
rather than
sense,
a linear sense, which is like often the way things are normally looked at. It's like a linear genealogy, whereas we'll look at like the discontinuities, the contradictions.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right. The moments of kind of, to use some Maoist terminology, moments of continuity
Rupture.
and rupture. Yeah, right. There's things that cause both stability and instability within social systems, within historical epochs. There are forces that are trying to maintain status quo and forces that are trying to disrupt it. And sometimes, those forces that maintain the status quo are really effective and last for very, very long periods of time. Liberal historiography tends to be very trans-historical by context and looking at things kind of in isolation and as sort of a disconnected,
like ideas.
Jumble of events. And I think ideas is maybe...
And men and great men.
Right.
That's often like great men theory.
Great men are both, centering the power of ideas and centering particularly the ideas of great men, I think is characteristic of liberal historiography. And
even left liberal historiography, right?
Yeah, it frequently is, yes. But I think, and right, like the tendency in like left liberal historiography is just, well, let's, shift the focus to the undervalued voices, right? Which I'm not saying is bad. Like, they want to go back and reread, and boost the stories of the otherwise marginalized folks, which I think is admirable. That's good. And I think Marxists and other heterodox thinkers should definitely be doing that. But that it tends to retain the great man framing, even if it is kind of ostensibly trying to bend the stick in the other direction.
And there's a perfect example of this is that I would compare someone like Oliver Stone, who's like a left liberal, versus David Harvey and how they talk about kind of neoliberalism. Is if you see like Oliver Stone's most recent documentary series that used to be on Netflix, it's not anymore, but it's called The Untold History of the United States. I think it's pretty good for like a
pop history type thing.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is it tells you a lot of the things that we aren't told in like American history textbooks in school, but he tells it still from this idea of great men. Like he'll show saying Roosevelt brought this like gentle era of capitalism. And then Reagan and Thatcher brought this neoliberalism. Right.
It's more like
Bush brought this war neocon ideology. And
it's more like
and it's ideas.
Right. And it seems to kind of almost be more about, in that way that you just talked about, like I think it seems to be a little bit more about evoking an affect than actually like talking about like concrete historical consequences.
Yes, and that's the difference between dialectical materialism, is because, well, number one, he misses the materialism, right? Is like the economic conditions of stagnation that kind of led to this shift in backwards towards like a classical liberal framework that we now got manifested as neoliberalism, but also the contradictions, because it's not just, of course, Ronald Reagan, but we saw neoliberalism emerge much early under someone like Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
It's obviously like there's a lot of contradictions in all of this. And
I can't remember who it was, but maybe it was Chomsky who said Nixon was the last liberal president.
Really? Wow.
I don't think, maybe it wasn't Chomsky. I can't remember who said that.
That's something I will also bring up, because Chomsky
Nixon also very famously said, we are all Keynesians.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
which is to say, which is referring to the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes, who, again, if we were to kind of take an idealist conception of history, John Maynard Keynes was solely responsible for, embedded liberalism.
Right.
Because, well, and of course, I do think that studying John Maynard Keynes and his theories is very important to understanding how embedded liberalism functioned kind of on a technical level. However, to kind of, and this is something that I've kind of had to undo in my learning of the history of economic thought, which is that, well, for one thing, Keynes was not the first to the punch in terms of kind of constructing, technocratic managerial sort of quasi-social democratic policy. And despite the tremendous intellectual accomplishment that his book, The General Theory of Money, Employment, and Interest is, it's a great work, no doubt. But, right, like I think a lot of folks will point to Keynes and Keynesianism and or, to use the term we've been using, embedded liberalism, as sort of this thing that was a product of Keynes himself, rather than like the multitude of other historically specific factors that acted in confluence to produce such a theory.
Yeah, and you at one point you mentioned Noam Chomsky, and that made me think of something. Is that he's an example of someone who he's actually like a self-described anarchist, but he often invokes classical liberalism from a left-wing point of view and says that the ideals of classical liberalism are actually compatible with social, what he calls libertarian socialist.
Yeah. All of my anarchist comrades call Chomsky a liberal.
Yeah, well, it's. I think the thing about Chomsky, I can't really tell if he does that because he's trying to seem very accessible to like whoever is interviewing him, like a audience, because he often invokes even people like Abraham Lincoln. Like I could see why he'll say stuff like John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith would be terrified at today's society. Well, maybe Adam Smith. I can see him invoking Adam Smith, but he'll often invoke like Abraham Lincoln, which I know Abraham Lincoln said some radical things like those who should work in the factories own them. But what did Abraham Lincoln do exactly that was really left wing, other than the slavery? But like that's also the great man bias, right? Is as if
right, and totally
that ignores all the slave revolts and the history that actually led to.
And the other thing that it ignores is that this was not because Lincoln was like a anti-racist, emancipator in his heart of hearts. No, that was a cynical, like, political move that he made to win the war.
Yeah, and it's also like the South not wanting to pay tariffs, all of the economic factors involved. But
right.
The thing is Chomsky he's not the first to make this argument that libertarian socialism and classical liberalism have things that are compatible. Like he'll invoke that not having a master and having moral equality and liberty are things that are all compatible. But this is like the idealist problem, right? Is you're looking at the ideals, but it leaves out a couple of things. Number one, how different people with different class interests interpret these ideals. Like liberty to people who are working class is very different from liberty who are a property owning class. And also like moral equality, as we showed before, it's like these things were not practiced, not obviously equality in economic sense, but not even moral equality. That's never exercised, even to this day, really, in liberal societies. Theoretically, everyone has moral equality over the law, but liberalism was founded on slavery. But even after slavery was abolished, there's so much systemic racism where it's clearly bollocks that people are equal of the law. Like you'll see the perfect example is this how black people are treated by juries versus white people, or the level of sentences. Or I would encourage anyone who hasn't read it already to look at the book The New Jim Crow.
Michelle Alexander.
Yeah. The thing is with what left liberals will typically appeal to, they'll say all these ideals and they'll say, well, don't you agree with that? That's compatible with leftism, right? And that but I could say at most maybe anarchism is like liberalism taken seriously, but even that, it's not. I wouldn't say anarchism is even compatible with liberalism because private property, like anarchists, maybe there's some differences among various anarchists, but primarily if you look at like the main anarchist theorists like Bakunin, Proudhon, or more recent anarchists of like 1980s and 70s, like Murray Bookchin, I mean, like they don't believe in private property. And of course, private property doesn't mean you don't believe in personal property. Like you can have your toothbrush in your house and all of that shit, right?
More than familiar with those sort of.
We're familiar with that, right?
Private like property means the offices, the buildings, the factories, and the land, not your toothbrush and not your TV.
I mean, we're familiar with that, but like so you'd be surprised, like a lot of people who are just trying to learn about this stuff, that's often what pushes them to the liberal direction is that
it's a very deliberate slippage too on the part of liberals and anti-communists, which is that the left wants to take away your toothbrush. I know it's a meme, but like it's so effective because this notion of and I always tie this to both the kind of logic of capital and capital accumulation, and also settler colonialism, right? Because the ideal of property in the United States in particular is really tied up, like who's even allowed to own property to begin with is historically, it's tied to, are you white? And the sort of things that still persist today in terms of who is and isn't allowed to kind of participate in so-called consumer society.
Yes,
because the example that I always go to is that Black unemployment is historically always disproportionately much higher than it is for white people. Generational wealth and that's right, like the logic of accumulation there, right? Like those are all deeply racialized factors that like liberalism can really kind of only pay superficial lip service to, because it doesn't want to actually like reckon with the like deep historical consequences of
this is the thing I would really want to dig into, is that the biggest problem with liberalism from Marxist point of view is that it's based fundamentally in abstractions, and it presupposes a kind of context of like harmony in which everyone agrees on something, and it often
live in the same reality.
Yeah, that too, right? Because it's like it doesn't consider that there's so many different ways to interpret these ideals or how to put them into practice, and some of them are so. There's the terms like communism works in theory but not in practice. But I would say like liberalism doesn't work in theory or in practice, because like for example, let's say equality, and I think Marx does a great job at talking about this in Critique of the Gotha Program, is liberals like to talk about equality, and the irony is communists are associated with wanting this like perfect equality, but that's not something really Marx emphasizes so much. For Marxism is like freedom, and to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And
all our needs are different. So
exactly. So like that's why we can't really have like equality is meaningless. Like how would a person with five kids be treated the same as one with one kid?
That's exactly what he talks about in Critique of the Gotha Program.
Exactly. And that's why Marxism fundamentally is just the materialist point of view. We look at like the concrete reality as opposed to this abstract ideals. And it seems maybe obvious in the way we're talking about it. But people would be surprised by the amount of left liberals in academia who will just not really, just won't entertain Marxism whatsoever. And they'll just try to theorize their way into a perfect society. I think John Rawls is the perfect example of this, but you also have like this whole school of left libertarianism, which is somehow not socialist, but it's like left libertarianism. They call it like, it is Rawlsian in many respects, but like the idea of like a property owning democracy. But it's all like in theory, right? Or you even have Rawls tries in a way to kind of like theorize inequality of outcome.
Rawls's whole thing is a thought experiment with the so-called veil of ignorance, which is that actually it's a lovely thought experiment. However, that is not.
It's a thought experiment.
It actually, I think, is pretty effective as a thought experiment. I think, however, the thing that it presupposes kind of implicitly is that either that is how our government already works, or that's how it could work potentially under with a few tweaks.
He met with Bill Clinton. Like that kind of reveals his mindset a little bit. Like he really believed that, maybe you could convince people in power to like adopt your ideals, which totally does not look at power in class dynamics.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing that really distinguishes, I would say, Marxism and anarchism from liberalism in this very big way, which is that liberalism, generally speaking, views the state as neutral. It's a neutral mediator between interests. And Marxists, clearly view the capitalist state as a, what is in the manifesto? They say, sorry.
I think it's in Marx's critique. Well, you can find like these kind of arguments in multiple writings, like whether it be Engels' Principles of Communism,
right,
or a certain passage in the manifesto. I think you're referring to, but
yeah,
also there's Marx's
a
critique of Hegel's philosophy of right.
Yeah,
like that's the big one where he kind of like critiques the idea of Hegel's liberal theorization of the state being this like neutral protector of freedom.
Well, and the particular passage that I'm thinking of, and again, I'm kind of quoting from memory, so this may be off by a word here and there, but the modern executive state is little more than a managing committee for the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. Right? So the Marxist view is very explicitly that the capitalist state serves the interests of the capitalist class, and it is inextricable from kind of maintaining, right? Like capitalists are in competition with each other, however, they are, and again, to paraphrase Marx, they're a band of warring brothers, right? They fight over some things, but they know that they have a common interest in preserving their class power. So that is what the capitalist state is for from the Marxist perspective, I think, anarchists have, I think, a much more, and I'm probably going to get raked over the coals for this because I don't know anarchist theory very well, but I think that their conception of the state is much more broad and transhistorical in that, the state as such is, a self-perpetuating institution of power, and, that you can't, like, for example, have a socialist state because the whole idea of anarchist socialism or anarchist communism is to abolish the state as such, and not in the Marxist conception, which does provide room for a state that is controlled by proletarian class power. That's a whole different can of worms. I don't want to get into that. However, and again, apologies to my anarchist comrades out there. I'm probably engaging in a bit of caricature. I'm sincerely not trying to strawman anybody. However, what I am trying to get at is that both anarchism and Marxism, in contradistinction to liberalism, both conceive of the state as an institution of power, of capital.
Pretty much like that's what the anarchists and Marxists really agree on, is that the state is, an instrument of class domination. You can see that with the interests that the police have, or the military and global imperialism, or just the way laws are structured, right, to really protect private property above all else. And I think it's, one thing just to clarify is that when we say like this state is an instrument of class domination, that doesn't mean that all the politicians are actively thinking to themselves, oh, how am I going to like serve all these corporations and fuck everyone else, just like I serve the corporate power. While that may be kind of the case in America, because America is like reaching the point of kleptocracy, where like people
straight up, Plutarchic fascism, which I think I'm sort of arriving at an analysis here that neoliberalism has kind of in practice, and we can maybe talk about this later or perhaps in a different podcast episode altogether, but I personally am of the mind that what we have been calling neoliberalism in the United States and kind of the rest of the sort of Anglo-American capitalist world in the last 40 years has really just been a slow creep of what we historically have called fascism. We've seen a total repression of proletarian movements and workers' power. We've seen drastic militarization of police, massive expansion of kind of imperialist warfare and military secret coups and that sort of thing. And we've seen a electoral system that has was never very democratic to begin with. However, it's becoming really just drastically more undemocratic with the consolidation of monopoly power in the hands of fewer and fewer big players, and the consolidation of political power in the hands of increasingly reactionary politicians and so on. So that's my thesis anyway. Maybe that's a spicy take, but that's a hill I'll die on.
Well, that's actually kind of what I wanted. I'm going to push back on that a little bit, but that's something I was going to bring up towards the end.
That's
is what differentiates liberalism and fascism. But before that, I just want to clarify the original point is that when we say it's not just always in America, this is more the case where the politicians are actively funded by corporations in their campaigns. But I think if you compare a lot of European capitalist liberal states, and it's not so direct. It's more so that the laws of the state from its very inception are designed to protect capital. If you look at the way laws are structured, it is literally to protect private property. It's not about proletarian power or anything like that. So it's more the institutions, and as well as the way. Do you ever find we might think it's a coincidence that it's so hard to pass legislation that benefits workers, but it's so easy to just immediately start wars, get funding for them, or to or take away worker rights.
Right, or give Jeff Bezos $10 billion so he can buy the James Bond franchise.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve is a perfect
he wanted
example. The Federal Reserve is literally autonomous from, it's theoretically autonomous from the presidency, and they act so-called neutrally, but it's not neutral, obviously. The Federal Reserve is just to bail out the corporations whenever they, screw up, basically.
Right.
As we saw in the coronavirus, they're willing to print how many $1 trillion immediately, but we ask for free college student debt alleviation, which is not even in the billions. It's
right. And we saw that back in 2008 and 2009 with the financial crash. There was suddenly hundreds of billions of dollars available to to buy up toxic assets that had gone bad in the crash, but not a fucking cent for the millions of people who had just lost their homes, or the people who are graduating college with thousands or hundreds of thousands or whatever of college debt and so on, right? And there was, of course, more money to dump into these predatory wars that only got worse under the Obama administration, of course, as we know. And by the Biden administration, that we just passed the biggest military spending bill in U.S. history since the end of World War II.
Yeah, well, it's not
nearly $1 trillion.
It's not surprised when when that's something that's occupied by the market, right? It's not even a public function. It's literally directly the market has hands in it when it comes to the stocks of Lockheed Martin and going up, and
Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and.
But you mentioned that what we call neoliberalism being very authoritarian could be called fascism. See, I'll push back on that because I would argue that contrary to liberalism, proclaiming the ideals of tolerance and democracy, right? Tolerance and democracy was always authoritarian from its very beginning. I don't think we can really point to many times in history of liberal states where there was this like tolerance and democratic, perfect democracy. Like there was always an element of authoritarianism. You can say, oh, how come Canada isn't as authoritarian in America? Well, it's because there's not as much dissent to crack down on. When there was a socialist dissent, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, there was during the Red Scare and 40s. In the Red Scare, our Prime Minister R.B. Bennett literally cracked down and deported suspected communists. When there is a threat, you'll see capitalist state all across the globe be super authoritarian when it comes to class domination. So I see like liberalism, it was always authoritarian in its practice, like liberal capitalism. So that's why I think we can't really look at it solely economically, because if we look at fascism as the merger of state and corporate power, and the one class dominating another class in desperation, like that's just really what liberal capitalism always was. So how do we call it fascism?
So let me interject and say that I think that the distinction that I have come to kind of embrace in my thinking and in my language about it is that I don't even disagree with what you just said. I think that so-called liberalism has had very tendency of social domination has been in there from its inception, and in practice has been incredibly authoritarian, especially for non-white folks. But I do think that fascism does actually represent a qualitative escalation, right? In the sense, in kind of a Hegelian sense, for the passage from quantitative change into qualitative change. I do think there are major, transformations at play that are not. Again, I think that they're all kind of, as you said, like they're inherent to the structure of existing institutions within capitalist state and within kind of the internal like ideological contradictions of liberalism itself. However, in its own racist history. However, I do think that fascism does represent a qualitative quantitative transformation. Getting all of my dialectical wires crossed here. The quantitative changes of escalating police violence, of escalating imperial interventions, and all these other things that we've been talking about. I do think that it does actually lead to like a big qualitative leap in terms of how far the state will go to get what it wants and protect the interests of bourgeoisie, and like things like world wars have been coincident with it. And I think that personally, the reason that I go as far as calling the current epoch fascist as opposed to simply neoliberal is that that does seem to be where the internal tendencies of capital right now are leading, because we see the foreign policy kind of establishment is increasingly kind of aiming its guns at Russia and China, and basically threatening all of us with another giant world war.
But this is what I'll say though, is like how we still are left without a real way to distinguish liberalism from fascism, because the thing is I just don't think we can really analyze it solely economically. The reason why I think we actually do need almost an idealist way to look at fascism is because fascism itself is an idealist, a completely idealist, ideology that is very different from how it is in practice. Like if, for example, like if we can look at, I think the best way to differentiate liberalism and fascism is to look at the difference between reactionary and liberal thinkers, why they often kind of supported a lot of the same things. And of course, when fascism in practice, is state capitalism, like Nazi Germany, despite presenting itself as national socialism and kind of using this occult mythology, was just really ramped up state capitalism. Same with Mussolini. But if we look at like thinkers like Julius Evola, who's often thought of as like one of the most important thinkers of the far right,
grandpappy of fascism.
Yeah, like I mean, someone like Steve Bannon overtly worships him, and you have people like Julius Evola. They advocate more or less for a form of feudalism because they actually see capitalism is bad, liberal capitalism, because it's progressive and it erodes the family and tradition. So like their goal is like
Marx saying like all that is solid melts into air sense of that. Like
they're kind of right in a certain sense. So like the irony, right, is like someone being you can't really be like a conservative
in a very narrow sense. Yeah.
In a narrow sense, yeah. Like first of all, like, I could give a shit about tradition, but like someone who cares about tradition, like it's funny to be like a capitalist and be pro tradition because you see like why is the family disintegrating, and well, that's ultimately just because people have to work more.
Yeah.
Like, but the thing is people like Evola were kind of, I would say, like, to put it nicely, like the least contradictory reactionary thinkers in the sense that they actually had, I think, really like the only way to have a real conservatism is like a totally like a feudalistic order that's like a zero growth economy that just stays, and you can see he's not the first conservative to really advocate for a type of system like that, like Edmund Burke.
Right. Basically monarchists.
Yeah, monarchists.
Right.
And that's the thing is historically fascism has had so much overlap with monarchy. Like Franco's Spain is a perfect example. The Franco-fascists held up monarchist flags, and they often appealed to the old like time when Spain was like this, when Spain was feudalist and was like all powerful and had all these territories. So like there's that. There's also, in Mussolini's Italy, there was all these appeals to the Roman Empire.
Right. So Make Italy great again. Make Italy Rome again.
Yeah, somehow. Right?
Whereas
in practice, in practice, I think like the Marxist analysis is more accurate at describing reality, right? Like in the sense that in practice, what the ruling class does not want monarchism. Like they're the ones who rebelled against monarchism, right? Is they want capitalism, and they'll just use whatever ideology to dupe the masses. But this Marxian explanation of fascism doesn't really capture what fascism is as an idea, as an ideology, and how it appeals to people, right? That's where I take issue with kind of the economist understanding of it.
Right. Well, and that's something that I'll touch on, which is that I just want to be very clear, even though I do have this sort of political economic analysis, I don't discount other analyses. Like I don't think it can be reduced to solely those factors that I had been stressing. There are these kind of social psychological dimensions to fascism that appeal to a certain kind of subset of people, ostensibly the Herrenvolk, right, the master race, but
the settlers,
right,
middle class settlers,
right, exactly. Oh, and I think in the conditions, right. The other thing that I think a lot of people get hung up on is trying to look at fascism, sort of kind of trying to shoehorn it into this way of like always comparing it kind of one-to-one with Italy or Germany or Spain, which I think, don't get me wrong, I think it's very important to analyze those forms of fascism. However, I think we risk kind of falling into that sort of transhistorical thinking and constantly comparing everything to Nazi Germany doesn't hold up, because
no, absolutely not.
Right. Like,
well, I think Nazi Germany
analysis, right? The Marxist analysis is to the principle behind the Marxist historical analysis is to look at the historically specific features of the national culture and terrain, and specifically with as regards fascism, right? It is an appeal to the injured pride of the dominant social classes, which are, in the case of North America, are white settlers, which is, again, that we've seen this over the last, throughout the history of American far-right movements, but especially in the contemporary juncture, which is that, the base of MAGA and the Proud Boys are not, this sort of stereotype of like deindustrialized Midwesterners,
like the working class,
white working class. No, but it's like
It's factually untrue as well. Like there's been studies that they tend to be middle class.
Middle class, yes, exactly right. And again, it's not that like I think there's sort of this nuance that is maybe lost there, which is that
it's because the middle class they have a right to be angry, right? Because of like the 2008 recession, like they had this like hope of climate social mobility that was just totally shattered. But where I think like the so-called what people might call the class reductionists miss is they think that like the Trump supporters was the white proletariat, and because of that they think that just by using proletarian rhetoric and intersectional rhetoric that'll somehow appeal to them, which I think is totally like naive.
Well, it aligns several factors, which is one is that if you read a book like As Many Problems as I Have with It, a book like Settlers by J. Sakai, which is that historically the white working class has actually played this very reactionary role, which again I think that we need to wrestle with that, but then also we need to compound that and complicate that with the fact that the working class historically and today is disproportionately and actually, if you look at it on the international scale, overwhelmingly not white. Right?
Well, just go like try to take an Uber. Like the people who are driving the Uber, who are doing like a lot of the essential jobs, like are often immigrants, first gen or second gen.
Right. The labor market is both domestically and internationally is deeply racialized, and I think that is something that is elided by so-called class reductionists, and also in the analysis of fascism. The other thing that I think that we need to pick apart in fascism is that yes, the base of fascism it has its basis in middle class kind of ideals and sense of injured pride and opportunity. However,
there's the esoteric element. Like there's the esoteric element that appeals to people. Like
what I wanted to get at is that specifically with like white settler fascism is that it is by its very nature a cross-class project. It is like getting white proles and lumpen proles to identify with the oppressor, and to partake in the oppression of other working class people. I think we also have this very even if you don't like Settlers or whatever, which okay, fine.
I haven't read it,
but for folks who are maybe a little like this book really makes people uncomfortable, which I think is not a whole can of worms to unpack all of itself. But even if you wanted to just exclude that from your historical analysis, Lenin has this idea of, and it's I think also shared by Eugene Debs, of the labor aristocracy, which is also clearly a deeply racialized phenomenon. The labor aristocracy meaning the people, the higher paid workers, the professional managerial stratum, right? Like these are all stations in life, so to speak, that are disproportionately occupied by white workers.
Well, I will actually push back on that, because I think the labor aristocracy is almost like that's sort of been flipped on its head, at least in America. Because if we look at, for example, let's say tech workers, people work in big tech disproportionately paid better than people work in a lot of more declining industries. Mm-hmm. Is you see like a lot of studies being shown about like the majority of Facebook employees and Twitter employees and Google employees voting Democrat. And I think it's like almost, it's not so much like, I think Trump's appeal is more with like the prior maybe labor aristocracy that like is no longer that it's the lost the lost white middle class. Whereas now you kind of almost like Democrats are appealing to this like upper managerial class, so-called managerial class. But also I want to also say like all of Trump's supporters, like as we know, some reactionaries will make this argument, aren't all white, but that doesn't mean that like fascism has to be white. As we can see that like Latin America, plenty of examples of fascism, mostly all backed by the United States. But
or the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who's a virulent fascist
or Japan in World War II,
worships Adolf Hitler. However, like I think fascism, despite the fact that it's not necessarily just like ipso facto white with, capital W, I think it is nonetheless like very much. It's, well, I wouldn't even say that. That's not where I was going to go with it, which is that it is deeply European in character, even if it is not capital W white.
That's true, because if we can look at like Latin American fascists, it tends to usually be the whiter side of the population being in power and oppressing the indigenous.
Everyone from people like Janine Añez to Juan Guaido. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's another thing I wanted to say is like with fascism, right? Like Nazi Germany was almost an exception in that it used socialist rhetoric. More or less of the time, like
very surface at that, but yes.
Yeah, well, like most of the time, fascism manifests in a kind of religious form that is very overt, that it just like wants to maintain. Yeah, or that it just wants to like maintain hierarchies. Essentially, like it's pretty straightforward. We can even trace this back to conservative thinkers. Like it's, to me, I think there is a distinction between liberalism and fascism, but there isn't really a distinction between what we call like reactionary conservatism and fascism, because someone like Edmund Burke meets all the characteristics of a fascist in my view. Like, and what he describes is essentially like, a monarchy. But in practice, as we know, like the thing is, the nature of capitalism is that it can't really go backwards on an economic level. It always has to keep expanding. So despite all of like the fascist mythology of wanting to return to this past, it never can. And
right, it kind of knows that about itself too. Like that's,
well, I don't know if the people know, but like the leaders.
Well, sure, but like the engineers of fascism, so to speak, they know that there's no end game. They know that they're leading a death cult.
Well, Evola seemed to be pretty clueless. Like Evola threatened to like to conduct spells on Mussolini because he thought Mussolini was betraying the vision of fascism. And then when he was towards the end of his life, when Evola was asked about what his beliefs were, if he was like a fascist, and he said, "I'm a super fascist," to differentiate himself from Mussolini because he thought Mussolini wasn't a true fascist.
Yeah, like, hey, this guy's a wimp.
Well, it's like the thing. So here's
where didn't go far enough.
Here is on a economic, or not necessarily economic level, but on a material level where I would differentiate fascism and liberalism is if you look in like fascist countries, liberal countries are still very authoritarian. They have an illusion of democracy, or I would just say a bourgeois democracy, is Lenin would call it. Is yes, there is a democracy and there is like equality of property owners above the law.
Right. And Lenin says democracy in the capitalist nations remains as it was in the Greek polis, democracy of the slave owners.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there is like a distinction to be made. Like the thing is, and that's why Marx actually did support like bourgeois freedoms, because at the very least, like that were advanced under Otto von Bismarck, is that at least like there's like this possibility to win some things for the working class in this framework, whereas under fascism, there is no due process. There is not even shadow trials. You can just be executed.
Right.
And you can see the ideology in someone like, I would say Edmund Burke, like old conservatism, who thought that tolerance, that the liberal idea of tolerance was absurd because like if we're trying to defend private property, why would we even tolerate anything else?
Right.
And also like you see Carl Schmitt, like a Nazi theorist, basically, right? Who like Carl Schmitt basically thought that he hated liberalism, obviously not for the same reason the Marxists hated liberalism, but he hated the idea that there's even a chance that something progressive that could infringe on private property could ever happen, right? So I think there is something to like separate. Like I don't fascism, I wouldn't call Roosevelt a fascist, right? Like I think all of liberalism is authoritarian. Like we need to, of course, demystify the nonsense liberals will perpetuate, but at the same time, I think there is a line to be made between fascism and liberalism.
I think in the sense that we've been talking about it, that fascism on the ideological plane is liberalism without the pretensions to liberty. If that's makes sense.
I would agree with that.
Especially like in the way that Losurdo talks about it too, and not just in Liberalism, but his other book, War and Revolution, which is another really fantastic read that I hope everybody picks up. But like the other thing is that, like you mentioned, like the fascists, like, you can just be executed. Well, I mean, look at what's going on in the United States, like for one thing, for its whole history, but like right now, like the whole uprising this last year or so has been, precipitated because the police literally just executed a black man for a petty crime.
Mm-hmm.
And an alleged petty crime.
Well, yeah, and also there's also like the whole tolerance thing of liberals is nonsense, because obviously Eugene Debs, right, perfect example of someone who is locked up under the Espionage Act by Woodrow Wilson, because and you see this not just in America, but like R.B. Bennett in Canada and the Red Scare, or even Japan suppressing its Communist Party to the point where nowadays, despite being a very big party, the Japanese Communist Party is basically like a more or less a reformist party, because they're afraid of if they express revolutionary desires that they'll be purged. Yeah. So that tells you about liberalism. But the thing is like it could be worse, right? That's why I'll say is like liberalism. I will always choose like living under liberalism as opposed to fascism, just because there is loopholes. There is that kind of bourgeois freedoms. They need show trials. Right. They need to like find ways to legally prosecute you. Whereas under fascism, they can just send death squads.
The pretensions of liberal democracy are still more ideal than because they need to at least maintain a facade of fairness, and democracy does actually make a qualitative difference. However, I just wanted to, because we're on the subject, I wanted to kind of read this quote from Settlers Revisited that kind of encapsulates the problem that we're trying to unpack in this conversation, which is like, how do you distinguish like liberalism, liberal democracy, particularly in settler societies, from so-called fascism, which I think, other thinkers like the Black Panther George Jackson tries to get at in his book, Blood in My Eye. But just real quick, this quote here. In many settler societies historically, the white population not only supported the police, but in part they were the police. Unlike in old Europe, wherein the general masses of the people were kept disarmed and landless, in settler colonies, often the entire Euro-male culture revolved around the common and cheap access to land and firearms and the bodies of the oppressed. Posses or militias, or so-called committees of correspondence, or lynch mobs of armed men enforced the local settler dictatorship over Indians, Latinos, Africans, Asians, North Africans, women, and so on. And white men of all classes joined in to affirm their membership of the most important, quote, class of all. Emphasis mine here. Settlerism filled the space that fascism normally occupies. Later on, he says, neither the ruling class nor the white masses had any real need for fascism. What for? There was no class deadlock paralyzing society. There was already a long-standing, thinly disguised settler dictatorship over the colonial proletariat in North America. And he says, again, in the US, settlerism made fascism unnecessary. So yeah, I think that's...
That quote you just read pretty much really echoes what Losurdo was saying with a master race democracy, and that how this was essentially like the project of liberalism the whole time. But like in general, I think while I would make a distinction between liberalism and fascism, I don't think it's really accurate to really not make a distinction. But I will say that we can both agree that there's definitely like a slippery slope, and there's a reason why people often speak of the libertarianism to fascism pipeline. I think it's more like
absolutely,
because libertarianism more or less is just like what liberalism used to be, I would say.
With a really oddly racialized aspect, the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and the kind of that imagery of that epoch.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it's super accurate, just because, like, libertarians, despite being, not supposedly not caring about oppressing people on racial or gender lines, they really do. They just don't care enough, like the fascists do. And classical liberals, of course, we're fucking very racist.
I mean, this occupies my mind in thinking about fascism and liberal historiography. and how, right, like liberalism as we talk about it, and as Losurdo kind of unpacks, is frequently in the way that we understand it today is stories that liberalism tells about itself, about its own history, and in terms of its ideals rather than its purpose and practice. And I think that, particularly in unpacking its sort of racialized origins, I think makes talking about where fascism fits in the history of capitalism and colonialism. I'm not saying that it makes it impossible. It makes it more difficult to talk about, because liberals, I think, really like to think of liberalism and fascism as in total contradistinction. That liberalism,
or that communism is more and has more in common with fascism.
that the far left and the far right are just two sides of the same coin. Right? It's all bad. It's all authoritarianism.
Well, that's something I wanted to touch on a little bit. Is it's probably like the last thing, like, because we're gonna have to wrap it up soon. But
sure.
there's the thing about property, right? Like, some people often ask, this is a debate on the left a lot, is liberalism compatible with Marxism? Or just vaguely, sometimes people will say, is liberalism compatible with socialism / communism? And I could see how you can make a case, but I would say you ultimately can't. Like, this is my take. I want to hear yours after. Is that, in my opinion, the Salvador Allende experiment is an example of why liberalism and socialism aren't compatible, is because the thing is Allende tried to essentially work within a liberal framework to implement socialism. And as a result, he, like, instead of just seizing the industries from the rich oligarchs who own them, he, like, bought them, legally, using, like, the property rights instead of just seizing them, like how Cuba did. And first of all, that actually, like, heavily put Chile in a big debt, and they ended up, like, overthrowing him anyway and basically killing all the communists. So it doesn't really matter if you respect the law. Like, the property owning class will change the law or resort to full fascism just to get their way. So that what I mean is, I don't think they're compatible. And the reason why I thought of this is just because I remember when I was having a conversation with a person who was, like, worked for the NDP, which is, like, in Canada, the Social Democratic Party. And I said, we need to nationalize oil in Canada and all our natural resources, because that's the basis of our economy, and it's all, like, it's all taken by private corporations. And they said it wouldn't be worth the task because we have to buy the oil reserves from the companies that occupy them. And I was like, no, we don't. Like, no one owns the oil, right? And I think that's right there is what differentiates liberals from Marxists and anarchists, is we don't really believe in this intrinsic idea of private property. Like, I'm sorry, national resources are not private property, or land that's there before anyone,
or respect, or this kind of abstract, like, just respect for the rules. Like, liberals really are all about doing things by the letter of the law. I heard some liberal commentator calling Joe Biden the new law and order president because, like, he's against the so-called insurrectionists of January 6th.
Yeah, and that's why that was what was so terrifying about that incident, is that people who were mad about it on the media, they weren't mad because of what the insurrection was about, like the fascist element. They were, like, mad about the fact that they were just disobeying the laws, which is a completely different.
Never mind that this is, like, a huge agglomeration of a bunch of people who, given the chance, would seize state power and probably, escalate its, fascistic dimensions to levels that are far beyond its current scope. If they actually had the wherewithal to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing with property rights is, like, it's not just problematic in practice, but it's even wrong in theory. And we can trace it back to John Locke's justification for property and his criticism of indigenous people in, I think it's A Letter Concerning concerning tolerance, where he says, well, first in the Two Treatises of Government, he famously says that a person who puts in labor to make use of a land should own it, and they have a right to own it. And that's what gives private property, is like you making use of that property, of that land. And he says like the reason why indigenous people, you need to steal their shit is because they don't make use of their land.
And the irony, right, colonialism.
Basically, but the irony, the even bigger irony with John Locke is that it's not the people who do the work who own the land. It's like you basically just rich people buy the land and
then buy slaves.
Get slaves to do all the work, or like slavery and capitalism.
Slaves of whatever variety, chattel or wage slaves.
Basically, yeah. So it's like it's wrong in theory. So it's what I think is then we're left with this question. What is there any real reason why we still need liberalism? And is there any way, like, do we need to be having this conversation as to why they're compatible? I think we should. I think the whole reason
why asking the wrong question.
It's like Marxism was invented as like a superior left-wing ideology, right? And same with anarchism. It's like it's just better at actually realizing, the emancipation for the many.
And I think really the frame of that conversation, is liberalism compatible or whatever, or can Marxism fully realize the failed ideals of liberalism or whatever? I think it fundamentally, rhetorically speaking, gives up way too much ground to liberalism and capitalism, because fundamentally what I think is kind of, maybe not explicitly on the table there, but what I think is kind of being softly implied is an argument for reformism, that social democratic policy, perhaps cloaked in Marxism, can basically be reintroduced. I think that's my conspiracy theory brain thinking there on that kind of more abstract level of like, what is this argument doing in terms of shifting the conversation?
Yeah, it's like liberal socialism. An approach would be, let's give Amazon the option to offer ownership to their workers if they go bankrupt, rather than just being like, no, Amazon. Well, first of all, too big to be owned by the workers. I think like Amazon needs to be nationalized, but
like nationalize Amazon and like give it a $20 an hour minimum wage or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Or in the case of like, small business owners, how many like small business owners are going to like voluntarily give their business to the workers? Like you think
or that we can just kind of we can work or co-op our way into socialism,
exactly.
Which
or that again, we can even get worker co-ops. Like that's the thing is
right.
Like, even
this wishful thinking to begin with.
Exactly. And it's,
which is not to say, which I think importantly is not to say that we should not have worker co-ops. Like I don't think that they're not a bad thing. Like, let me be clear about that. I just,
no, we want worker co-ops, but like, I don't think you can even achieve that on like a liberal framework.
Right. And like the other thing is that thinking politically in terms of, what worker co-ops or unions for that matter do. And this takes us back to Lenin and his polemics against the economists, which is that, you can't just kind of implant yourself within sort of class struggle, like in these very kind of one-dimensional bread and butter ways, and expect, political consciousness to kind of just magically bloom out of that. Like political organization needs to be a co-constitutive factor there. Like, and that's specifically of what, like, there's a lot of confusion about like what Lenin means by like political consciousness coming from without. All he's saying there, this is my read of Lenin, is that you like trade union, what he calls trade union consciousness. Like you can't just expect organizations under capitalism, within the capitalist framework, even if they are struggling for, workers' rights, they're struggling to renegotiate the terms of their own exploitation. And so, the job of revolutionary political organization is to give political context to those struggles, and not from like the position of like, this is kind of the Leninist caricature of like a self-selected elite so-called vanguard party, but of a movement that is of and with that.
Well, the early stages of the Russian Revolution it was in many ways more liberal than what liberals could ever dream of or idealize.
Right,
but
in this very kind of organic way too.
Yeah, but like as that aside, that's like a whole different conversation almost.
Yeah.
But it's funny that people often refer to Lenin and juxtapose him with Rosa Luxemburg as if Lenin was like anti-democracy and Rosa Luxemburg was like the democracy one. Whereas people like this, where people like
a deep misreading of Luxemburg's own politics as well.
Well, it's because
she was very much a democratic centralist in that kind of pejorative sense that Leninists are besmirched for.
Well, it's people have like a really, I think, inherently liberal idea of what democracy is, because the thing is like, democratic socialism in the way Rosa Luxemburg articulates it is not like AOC democratic socialism, obviously, because like the way democratic socialists today, like, Corbyn, AOC, Bernie, whatever, they'll advocate like it's like democratically making every transition. So it's like, oh, you need the consent of like the rich people to take away their wealth. Well, that's not going to fucking happen.
No.
And,
like, Luxemburg remained at her core, she was a revolutionary.
Exactly. And that's where she disagreed with like Bernstein, right?
Right. And her whole case in Reform and Revolution is like, yeah, we can kind of do these like intermediary, like not, but they're, like parliamentary sort of moves, but those are not ipso facto what's going to get us to socialism. They are ways that we can, give ourselves a platform and raise political consciousness and, but like ultimately, Bernstein, you can't just reform your way.
Vote your way in.
Vote your way into socialism.
Let's also be clear that anarchists too, like anarchists are often, some anarchists themselves will believe this, but usually not the ones who actually read the theory and look at the history of anarchism. But anarchists also aren't like naively thinking that you can just ask the consent of all like the rich property owners.
I think this is where like a lot of folks get kind of lost on this notion of like what authority or so-called like the state is.
And it's like, we don't want to think about it, right? Because it's not pretty. Like no one wants authoritarianism, but the reality is like, think about it this way. Like the upper rich classes are going to fund private militias to like kill, instill a fascist dictator to like destroy, castrate people, like torture people, all kind of horrible things. So it's like, sometimes, we got to like reconcile with that a little bit. In that, what do we mean by democracy? We mean democracy for the people who do the work, and that's, of course, the majority of the population.
Right. I just one more thing that I wanted to hammer on since you brought up the Nazis again, which is that, and Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios talks about this in his videos about fascism, which is that we have this kind of, in this cultural imaginary, fascists, Nazis are cartoon villains. They're unequivocally, kind of primordial evil. And that really damages our ability to talk about, because it depoliticizes what fascism, what Nazism is and was.
Yeah, and it makes it seem like there is no context materially from that. That's why it's often like portrayed as if Hitler just came out of nowhere.
Right, and he used his magic charisma and he hypnotized the masses and blah blah blah. It's such bullshit. It's like,
and people will leave out that America supported Franco even after World War II, and
or that
installed so many dictators everywhere,
and that major American industrialists supported Hitler right up until the U.S. decided it was going to go to war.
And we support monarchies now, like Saudi Arabia,
and fascist dictators like Duterte and Agnes.
Bolsonaro.
And yeah, absolutely.
No, I think we've hit on all the points so far. We destroyed liberalism with facts and logic. Liberalism is gone. Now we get a socialist utopia.
I'll play
that. I'll play that at the end. But yeah, on a serious note, if you guys enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and also maybe share it with your friends. And so if you guys enjoyed, definitely go check out our channel, follow her on Twitter. And it's been nice having you on.
Right on. Yeah, thank you very much.